The Arizona sun had a way of burning everything that dared to stand beneath it. The year was 1872, and the wind carried dust and silence across the plains, a silence that wasn't peace, but tension waiting to break between the white settlers expanding westward and the Apache warriors defending their homeland. There was no trust, no mercy, no understanding, just survival, and in the middle of that vast and bitter land lived a man named Thomas Grady, a poor rancher who owned barely enough cattle to feed his family and a patch of land so dry it could break your heart. Just looking at it, he wasn't a man of war, nor a man of politics. He was just trying to make a life out there, one broken fence post at a time. Thomas had seen too much killing, the war between settlers, and the Apache had taken everything from people on both sides. He had lost 2 neighbors to raids. The Apaches, in turn, had seen their villages burned, and their children starved. Hatred grew like weeds under that desert sun. But Thomas wasn't built for hate. He was a quiet man with a slow voice and eyes that had seen too much of life's cruelty to believe in vengeance anymore. One afternoon, as the sun sank low and painted the desert gold, Thomas heard something, a sound not from a horse, not from cattle, but from men. He reached for his rifle. 3 figures stumbled toward his property line. They were Apache, one barely standing, another limping, and the third clutching his arm, blood staining his buckskin sleeve. Thomas froze. His heart pounded like a drum inside his ribs. In those days, an Apache on your land was a death sentence waiting to happen. Yet as he looked closer, he saw their exhaustion. Their faces were not those of warriors on the hunt, but of men who had been hunted. They stopped a dozen yards from his well, the only source of water for miles. Their horses were gone. Their eyes were hollow, desperate. And for a moment the air stood still. The rancher's hand gripped the rifle tighter, his mind whispering, "Shoot before they shoot you." But his soul, that quiet, worn-out part of him that still remembered what mercy felt like, whispered something else. Their men dying of thirst. Thomas lowered his rifle. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dry earth. The Apaches tensed, one reaching weakly for a knife that he could barely lift. Thomas raised a hand, not in power, but peace. Slowly, he moved to the well, tied a rope to the bucket, and let it drop. The sound of the bucket hitting water echoed like thunder through that empty land. He pulled it up and poured it into a trough, then another, and another. He didn't speak. He didn't move closer. He just gave them water. The oldest Apache, his hair streaked with gray, looked at Thomas for a long time. No words, just a look. The kind that passes between men who understand what the other has lost. They drank, cautiously at first, then desperately when they were done. The old warrior nodded once, slow and deep. Then they turned and walked away into the desert. Thomas stood there for a long time, the rope still in his hands, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. For days he expected vengeance, for other settlers to find out and call him a traitor, or for an Apache arrow to find his chest in the night, but none. Came only silence. Weeks later, he found out the truth. A cavalry patrol rode through his land, their officer telling stories of how they had cornered an Apache band near the San Pedro Valley, a band that had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. That same patrol had been ambushed 2 nights later, not by Apaches, but by a desert storm so violent it nearly wiped them out. Guess the savages had the gods on their side that night, one soldier joked. Thomas just listened quietly, staring into the dust. But something in the wind felt different. When Thomas went to mend a fence weeks later, he found something resting on the post, an eagle feather tied with rawhide. It was a sign of respect, left by someone who had not forgotten. He took the feather, held it against his chest, and understood kindness, even in a land carved by hatred, had power enough to bend fate, maybe even to end a war. The story of Thomas Grady would become a whisper passed through the desert towns and the tribal fires, the story of a poor rancher who gave water to his enemies, and while wars would still rage and blood would still be spilled, that single act, one man's quiet mercy, had begun to change hearts on both sides. Because sometimes all it takes is one act of courage to remind men that humanity runs deeper than vengeance. Months had passed since the day Thomas offered water to his Apache enemies. Life returned to its dusty rhythm. The cattle grazed, fences broke, the sun rose and fell, and the desert kept its secrets. But the world around him was shifting. Word had spread quietly, carried by traders, scouts, and whispers, that a white man had shown mercy to Apache warriors. To some settlers, Thomas was a fool. To others, he was a man of God. But to the Apaches, his name was becoming legend. The rancher who gave water when the desert gave death. One evening, as the horizon bled red with sunset, a storm rolled in, not rain, but fire flames lit the distant hills. Thomas could see it from his porch, the smoke curling like a serpent into the sky. The cavalry was burning Apache camps again, retaliation for another raid. The smell of burning sage and sorrow filled the wind. Thomas's heart ached. He knew it wasn't over. The cycle of revenge had come alive once more later. That night, thunder rolled like distant drums. Thomas was half asleep when the dogs began barking. He reached for his rifle, stepping onto the porch shapes. Moved in the darkness, silent, ghostly, he braced himself. Dozen Apache warriors emerged from the shadows, faces painted for war. The leader stepped forward. The same gray-haired warrior he had once given water to. He spoke in broken English. "You gave water, now we give you life. Soldiers, come, you leave now." Thomas didn't move. "What do you mean?" he asked, but before the man could answer, the sound of hooves thundered. In the distance, the U.S. cavalry was coming, and they weren't coming to talk. Without hesitation, the Apache leader motioned for Thomas to follow. "Come." He said, "You helped us, now we help you." For the first time, the rancher understood. His act of mercy had not been forgotten. The Apaches led him and his family through a hidden canyon under the burning sky, guiding them to safety as gunfire cracked in the distance. The cavalry rode past, never knowing the man they sought had been saved by those they called enemies. At dawn, the Apaches vanished back into the desert, leaving no footprints. Only the old warrior remained a moment longer. He looked at Thomas and said quietly, "War take everything but water, give life, remember." Then he was gone. Years later, when peace finally came to that corner of the frontier, settlers would tell stories of the night the sky burned and a rancher's kindness saved his family. And perhaps more than that, they said the Apache raids in that region stopped soon after, that a fragile peace had formed, built not from treaties or guns, but from respect and a single act of compassion. Under the desert sun, Thomas Grady grew old on that land. His ranch never became rich, but his story did. Travelers came to hear it. Preachers, soldiers, even young men chasing dreams of the West. He would simply smile and say, "Don't mistake kindness for weakness. It's the hardest thing a man can do out here." And when he passed on, they found one thing beside his bed, that same eagle feather, worn but untouched by time, because in a world where hate once ruled, one man's mercy had changed everything. If you believe the frontier still holds lessons for us today, lessons about courage, mercy, and what it means to be human, then hit that subscribe button and stay with us more. Stories like this one are coming, stories of forgotten heroes, real moments of compassion and the courage that shapes history.